Ross Pinder, welcome to the Constraints Collective podcast and the 50th edition or episode, sorry, of the Constraints Collective podcast. So we wanted a very, very special guest, and I mean that sincerely. You definitely weren't number 8 on the list. You were definitely number 1. So yeah, really, really good to see you. And is this a bit of an East Midlands meet up? Is it?
It is. It's a
Yeah,
massive
it's a, wow.
Midland.
Even though
Midlands reunion.
even though I'm the only one in the East Midlands, yeah. So yeah, how you doing, Ross? You good?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And it's all my ducking and diving to avoid being on the podcast has resulted in me hitting the milestone 50th. So I'm pleased to be that 50th guest.
I did say to Ian, he's not a bigger diva than Marco Sullivan, is he, Ross? Trying to get him nailed down, but anyway, sure Mark won't mind me saying that. He'll know what I mean. Ian, how are you? You all right?
Very well, thank you. Yeah,
good. Yeah. Golf going well, leisurely life going well.
Yeah, just moving houses, you know, Martin, and
yes,
working, which is ridiculous. I don't know why, but I've not been on a golf course last Saturday, so
we'll hold him there, Ross, because else he won't stop for an hour. Anyway, enough of that. Okay, so Ross, I think if you don't mind, it'd be a really good start if you could maybe just give us a bit of an introduction to yourself, like you without sounding corny, your journey and what you've been up to and what you're doing now, because it is really interesting. And we are growing the audience, believe it or not, internationally. So I do think there may be some people that are not aware of you and your work. So yeah, if you could give us a bit of an intro, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'll probably start with where you find me now, and then maybe go back through the classic journey story. I'm currently I'm 1 year into a 2-year secondment role at the Australian Institute of Sport, where my role is titled Learning Design Lead. So essentially, I've been, charged with reimagining our approach to skill acquisition and practice design for the Australian high performance system. So that's the Olympic, Paralympic, and Commonwealth Games sports. That comes, like I say, secondment role from Paralympics Australia, where I've spent over a decade, 3 Paralympic cycles, working across a whole range of Paralympic programs, working closely with coaches and athletes to, challenge our thinking in this space. And that's probably, really resulted in me getting this opportunity to, to think a bit differently and drive a slightly different direction, or evolve our direction moving forward. I started off going to uni to do sports science with a view that I was then going to go into the police force. I wanted to be a detective. And I guess the thread that runs through is my, interest in solving complex problems. So that was my plan. I went to do sports science because that was the interest from high school. And I had a plan to do a science degree and then look for accelerated promotion in the police force. And I got into sports science. I was like most sports scientists back then. I think the only thing I really knew was physiology. I thought that's what a sports scientist was, and then started exploring biomechanics and motor learning. And I got really curious off the back of an exam, which turns out that Ian had set when he was at Sheffield Hallam. And I got really curious around some of the work in long jump. So some of the work that Keith was involved in, looking at how we regulate our stride length into the board. So how we use information from our environment to monitor and adjust our movements. And when I was younger, I was a long jumper. Or I participated in long jump. So this was that's complete opposite of what I thought we were doing when we were training, was that, looking for that stereotyped, repeatable path. So that got me thinking, well, what else that I think is correct is actually not quite the case. That led me to explore perception action areas in cricket, and complete a PhD in Brisbane. And tended to follow a natural academic path. There wasn't a lot of applied opportunities. It was a lot about who you knew, or a few roles at the AIS back then. And so I followed the natural path into teaching, into a dual research academic role. And then I got this opportunity to do some consultancy with Paralympic sport. And that for me was the shift in thinking, the shift in trajectory that led to me being in this secondment role now.
Cool. So I'm guessing you I won't say followed Ian around the world, but it was definitely an influence then. Is that right, Ian?
Well, I don't think we've time to tell the story, but it's an amazing connection that I played cricket with Ross's PE teacher.
Yeah.
At school, and what our school used to play against Ross's school. And Ross then went to uni because of Mike, who was his head of PE. And then we sort of connected accidentally through Keith, didn't he? So it's more a connection with Keith, who was visiting Sheffield, and heard, I think, who was it? Is it Wheaty or John Wheaty?
Yeah, John
mentioned,
Wheaty,
yeah, had mentioned that Keith was here and mentioned that you were doing some work, and then pulled you out of the lecture, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, I got the opportunity to come out and do some data collection for my master's in Brisbane, and then we rolled into the PhD after that. But we didn't know any of that story until I was in Brisbane doing the PhD. So the number of potential connections and Ian's been heavily influential in the opportunity to obviously come to Brisbane, the additional opportunities that he threw to students to gain teaching experience, to gain tutoring experience, to gain valuable experience of bowling at his up and coming batsman in Renshaw. So yeah, very pivotal in terms of those opportunities, and has stayed a really close mentor, particularly when I started to do applied work, and was very quickly humbled and needed lots of advice from different people.
Great point, that, sliding doors moment and all that. But I love the point about going into an applied setting and getting humbled very quickly. It's always a good thing to do for people working in this space, I think, from an academic perspective. Ross, you mentioned at the beginning you are a learning design. What was the title? Sorry.
So my title is learning design lead.
Lead, so I've not heard that term used in the UK in a sport and exercise or a sports science context, in soccer clubs, football, rugby, whatever it might be, Olympic sports. I've not heard that term. So that really interests me. And I do obviously know a bit of background to this, but I think it would be really interesting for listeners. Could you just go into a bit of detail around what that actually entails as your role? Like what would that look like on the ground, day to day, week to week, or even, I know you're obviously working in an Olympic cycle, so Paralympic cycle. So could you go into a bit of detail around that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a little bit about how we're looking to evolve the applied support in Australia. So my role over the last 10, 12 years has been a skill acquisition specialist. What we're trying to do in Australia at the moment is continue to evolve how we work and where we work. And there's some pivotal people in our system that recognise an opportunity to not only capitalise on what was already happening, Australia being one of the world leaders in applied skill acquisition off the back of people like Damien Farrow, people like Rick Shuttleworth, through to the evolution of the AIS, other students that have come through under Ian, like Dan Greenwood. And then there was a period where our systems changed, our funding changed, and the access and use of skill acquisition started to change. And so we're now back at a point where we're starting to build our network of specialists. We're building new opportunities for practitioners coming through. And we've really recognized that this is an opportunity for us to double down on that, but also, I guess, continue to challenge our thinking about how we work. So some great examples of, I've done some work with some of our Paralympic programs, built some really great relationships with coaches, really challenged thinking and evolved how we practice. But often if you move on or that coach moves on, the legacy of what that work is not necessarily sustained. So it was about how do we continue to get even better at supporting sports in this area. And so there was this call out to evolve our thinking, and the terminology that we've started to land on is learning design. So that's slightly redefining, I guess, our role, how we work, and being able to, I guess, better capture what was already happening. So skill acquisition sometimes is quite a challenging term for sports. Sometimes it's a little bit off-putting for coaches, skill being really their domain, their core practice. But it also probably didn't capture the breadth of what specialists in Australia were exploring in terms of designing and supporting coaches to design really effective learning environments. So it's a little bit of a rebrand, for want of a better word. It's a way to capture more about how we work and position ourselves probably more closer to coach development than a performance support service. And so that's really based off the collaboration and the scoping across the entire HP system here in Australia. So a bit of a long way of saying it's an evolution, I guess, of what we would have termed skill acquisition in the past. Skill acquisition principles being a really fundamental underpinning of learning design, but they're not necessarily the breadth of the work that might go into the roles, with the nature of how interdisciplinary it is.
Ian, I think crucially there, the actual that title, learning design, is so important. Like some people listening might be thinking, well, what's the difference? Like, why? But I think the fact that if coaches are thinking about learning, so thinking about your paper around, what's the paper about? Reframing the learning and performance. What was the paper? Sorry, just remind me. So thinking about that, and then thinking about yourself as a designer rather than an instructor, delivering, routines, repetition, these types of things. I think it's such a significant shift in how we think about, how coaches think about how they can engage with athletes, how they can work with athletes, and actually what their role is. So if you really dig down to the meaning of those two words, I think that can have a real significant impact, on how we might think about our role as a coach, as a performance director, whatever it might be. Yeah, so I think that's really significant. I don't know what you think, Ian.
I think it provides more opportunities than just being called a skill acquisition specialist, because it opens the thinking up to being more holistic, I guess, which fits really nicely with your ideas around department of methodology, because the physiologist has to be involved in designing the learning, the sports psychologist has to be designed, and so on and so on. So, and I think the other key thing, the term skill acquisition specialist, I think when we had Georgia Askew, who was supervised by Ross and myself on one of the earlier podcasts, she was saying to us that coaches were saying to her, I didn't really realize what you did. Like skill acquisition specialists limited my understanding of what you could offer. He said, but now I get it now. And I think the learning designer captures that a lot more significantly as well.
So it can encompass the multi-dimensional nature of performance, can't it? Like you say, it's not just developing a movement, let's call it a movement, or it can encompass everything that an athlete, a team might experience in competition.
And just to link back, this has not come from out thin air. This has come from Ross's work of 10 years within Para, and the shift in the way that you design sessions So I'd love you to talk about some of your work with Para, Ross, about what you found when you got in, what you learned, how you work with coaches, etc., etc. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, it's not something we've taken lightly, this shift in language, and I've been very mindful of the fact we're building on the great work that has established Skill in Australia for 20, 25 plus years. So it's something we've thought really carefully about. It's something we've also heard very strongly from our sport, our institutes and our sports, and has really been driven and backed by people within our system. And like Ian says, it's kind of been an evolution of what was already happening. It's not okay, this is now we're redefining and this is how we're going to work in the future. This is how we were already starting to work, particularly in the para space, given the opportunity I was provided over the last decade, and bringing students on and specialists on board like Georgia and others, and helping them to get experience and to grow in this space. That was really the para environment was, I think, the thing that really sparked a lot of the thinking. And there's a few reasons for that. One was, I guess, the creativity of what was the Australian Paralympic Committee at the time, of thinking of this role being sitting with the National Paralympic Committee, allowing a role to work across sports, to work directly with coaches and to share ideas, was such a great opportunity to get into sports, to explore, to support, and to meet coaches where they were at. And then the power environment, and I've spoken about this quite a lot recently, allows so many ingredients for innovation in this space. So many natural constraints and ingredients that allow you to challenge your thinking and allow coaches to challenge their thinking. So as I mentioned before, like when I first went into Para, I was fresh out of PhD, working in a university, and thought I had a lot of ideas and a lot of evidence. And then I went into some quite extreme environments of para sports I'd never seen before, working with athletes who had impairments I'd never been confronted with before, never worked with, and quickly realized I had very little, very little evidence of in those spaces, high performance sport, different impairment types. And so it really challenged your thinking about how you go about building relationships, building trust, and starting to co-design ways forward. And that was really the spark that then led me to start exploring new spaces. So often in sport, we think we're leading and we're innovating, but there's other industries that are already got models and frameworks and things that can be valuable. And what I was missing was I was missing a framework or a way to conceptualize the environments I was going into and the way to start solving problems. And one of the things that really, I guess, accelerated my thinking was the combining a design thinking approach with a constraints-led underpinning. And for me, a constraint-led approach through working with para was really it was a way of conceptualizing human movement. And it's just really exemplified by working in Paralympic spaces. Every athlete is an individual. Every athlete has strengths and limitations, but in the para space, there's just things that often you can't avoid. There's just things that are more obvious, that are either individualized or physical constraints. And that allows you to be more creative with how you start to solve problems in terms of training and learning design.
Yeah. So Ross, you mentioned the term a few times, co-design, and I can absolutely resonate with what you're saying here. So could you just talk a bit about like what's co-design first of all, And then, I mean, you sort of alluded to why it's important, how that might work in a specific context.
Yeah, sure. Again, co-design for me is epitomized in para spaces. And what we found was coaches were more open to new ideas, to adapting training, because there were so many additional factors to consider, which required collaboration with other people in the environment, most notably the athlete themselves. So when we talk about co-design, it's around how are we working as a team. Maybe that's an athlete and coaching partnership. Maybe that's myself as a skill acquisition specialist, a coach and an athlete. Maybe it's a broader performance team. But how are we understanding all those interacting constraints, all those pieces of the puzzle, knowing what our outcome goal is and how we're going to design the best, whether it's training task or whether it's a periodized plan. And again, I'm not going to blanket statement across all coaches or sports, because this is absolutely nowhere near true. But often with athletes that without disabilities, we have coaches that often come through that sport, have come from a playing or competing background, and have a lot of information about what it feels like, what it should look like, what they did in their training. On the flip side, in our Paralympic sports, a lot of our coaches actually transfer over from the non-disabled side or the Olympic side. A lot of our coaches don't have disabilities. And so they're working with a whole range of athletes that might have physical impairments, vision impairments, or intellectual impairments. And there's a much easier perceived gap in knowledge of what that athlete might feel, might think, might be experiencing in any particular moment. So there's already, you've broken down that barrier between contribution of athlete and coach, because there's information that the coach doesn't have access to. And I'd argue, again, that's the same for any athlete and coach. There's information that the athlete has that the coach isn't aware of. But again, with a para context, there's just some things that are a lot more front of mind, so to speak. Yeah. And so what I've probably seen over the last 10 years is there's a lot more opportunity for that collaboration and co-design because of the nature of the environments that we're in. Often that's because we're working in sports where we've got coaches who are volunteer or part-time, or we've got athletes with high support needs, or we've got low levels of funding. So we set up a lot of remote coaching, and suddenly you're changing the dynamic, and the athlete needs to contribute more because the coach isn't physically there in person. And we've done a fair bit of work in this with Ian and Sarah Taylor. And there's a fair bit of work available around our work in remote coaching. But there's just a whole range of these constraints, these factors, or these ingredients that lean into being able to be more collaborative, being more creative, and probably also open coaches up to challenging their thinking. And so I've had the privilege of working with a lot of incredible coaches that have been really open to having someone like myself in skill acquisition come in and really support them, but really challenge their thinking about what's possible in terms of learning design.
Yeah. Ross, people from outside skill or sports science discipline probably no idea what design thinking is. So you said you've meshed design thinking with constraint stuff. What is it?
Design thinking is a really simple framework for problem solving. That's essentially what it is, and it's really popular in corporate world, in technology, and it's a really simple concept. You can have it as a really simple step process, or you can dive deeper and get into the weeds with it. But it's essentially a user-centered problem-solving framework. And the really critical part is about empathizing and defining the problem before starting to try and solve it. And probably one of the things, the move to learning design, I guess the shift in thinking around our roles and how we work, and a large part of that is around defining the problem first, and therefore, if we define it and understand it really well, then designing the task, the environment, or what we need to in terms of an intervention becomes so much easier. One of the I'm pretty sure it's a misaligned quote, but one of the famous ones that's always attributed to Einstein is, if you give me an hour to solve a problem, I'll spend the first 55 minutes thinking about it. Or, if you give me an hour to chop down a tree, I think it was attributed to Abraham Lincoln, I'll spend the first 55 minutes sharpening the axe. And so design thinking places this real emphasis on empathy and definition. So that became everything in terms of how I worked with coaches, how we work with athletes, how we design practice tasks. So a design thinking approach could be a program redesign. It could be we've got this athlete, we've got this major event coming up, and this is our plan working back, and we use a design thinking process to design that program. But it could also be you're in a session and you're seeing a task unfold, and it's, okay, what are we seeing? What have we tried before? How might they react to that? Really deep understanding of the athlete or the coach that you're working with. And so that became a really simple but effective anchor for me to use things like a constraints framework, or to add in variability within training environments. And a lot of it came down to really understanding the coach and really understanding, it gets thrown around a lot of meeting them where they are, but it was also meeting them where they've come from. So a lot of our coaches have got vast experience in sport as an athlete or a competitor themselves. They've come into coaching, and a lot of, particularly in the high performance area, a lot have had a lot of success. And so actually really appreciating why they approach their coaching in the way they do, what underpins that, what beliefs they bring, and how we can start to collaborate from there. And central to that was this kind of internal process of design thinking to continue to iterate, understand the problem, redefine, and then start to ideate and come up with new solutions.
For me,
sorry, just because I think people, I think I would find it very interesting. So people might want to know more. Have you written about this in publications?
Yeah, Ian and I, I've never really written up the deep thinking behind it, but we gave a case study example in 2019. So it'll be Pinder and Renshaw 2019.
We'll share the link in the show notes, because I think people would like to know more about that potentially. But great.
Also, and we gave an example of sorry, go on in.
I was going to say it's also in George's work, which has been published as well. Some of the ideas.
Right, I'll get the links off him. But class. Sorry, Ian, we butted in.
We started off with a case study. Some of the work I'd done in para-athletics, and we demonstrated, I guess, how the collaboration between myself, the coach, and the athlete, how we worked back from, I guess, identifying a technical challenge, and really understanding what was causing that technical challenge, and then designing an intervention that could address that in a really creative way. And through that, and we can your readers or your listeners can disappear into the paper, but it was really around ensuring we didn't decompose the task. In long jump, there's been a lot of work through people like Dan Greenwood, people like who else has done the long jump research?
Well,
Chris McCosker,
Scott, yeah.
and a lot of
Mark Scott originally was
Marcus Scott originally, yeah.
To get into run-ups.
And I suppose it resonates a bit as well with it. Is it Sean Barris's work around the diving and bulking and stopping it and starting again, so the breaking it down? Is it similar to that?
Yeah, very similar, and probably inspired a lot by Sean's work in diving, because one of the solutions we came up with was to look at the use of an indoor foam pit in a gymnastics hall, so we could maintain some of the critical information of the run up and takeoff. We could reduce some of the loading on the athlete, given some of the physical challenges and impairment factors, but we could maintain the critical transition from run up to takeoff, but with a really safe and risk-friendly environment to allow the athlete to develop aerial skills that they just weren't able to develop in an outdoor environment. And so they weren't getting any opportunity to focus on those technical components. And then we had really structured, I guess, recalibrations or transfer back out to the outdoor environment every week. So rather than isolating a technical change in a gymnastics hall or in a gym, or we actually had a whole series of technical sessions that were then mirrored with, okay, now how much of that can we transfer out into the more representative environment?
What do you reckon the ratio was, Ross? About how many jumps would they have done in the foam pit before you then went back out and did the real thing, as it were, and then back in again?
Yeah, I probably can't remember now. But typically a long jumper might do 6 to 12 competitive jumps in a session, or full run-ups, if that. And you add in some of the physical loading and challenges of some athletes in Paralympic sport, that might be reduced even further. There might be additional fatigue factors. And so you're talking about a very small opportunity to practice some of those takeoff and aerial skills. So we might have then got 20 takeoffs indoors off a relatively full run-up, and then be able to look at trying to replicate that in 3 to 6 jumps on an alternative day that week. And so that whole project was probably leaning into a major event, probably 8 to 10 sessions of 40, 50 minutes additionally in that different environment, but with a really mindful of simplifying and maintaining the key information in the task, not decomposing it, and then ensuring that we had that opportunity to transfer and almost recalibrate with the more representative environment. And I think that's probably one of the things that's been lost with a little bit with the concept of representative design over the last few years.
What a great segue. I guess, one of the things that you're probably most published in and the most cited papers will be the papers on representative learning design. So just talk, I know it's going back to your PhD, which is, was the start of your journey, and you've done so much since, but probably really an important phase of your career in terms of looking at that and setting it up and where it's gone from there, and the impact it's had across the world. I think is amazing. So just talk us through a little bit about the RLD work.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's still the fundamental thing in my mind every time I work with a sport, every time I go to a session. The concept of representative design is there. I think a lot of the nuance, not everywhere, but in places, I think the nuance has been lost around a real shift towards we just replicate the competition environment. We replicate the game. We replicate what it should look like. And that's, I mean, I have to go back and read it again, to be honest, but that was never what we said. It was about what information needs to be present to allow maximum transfer. And when we first started to conceptualize the framework of representative learning design, it was around practice tasks and research tasks. You know, if this is what we want to study, then the information we have in that practice task or that training task or that research task has to be representative under a couple of measures of action fidelity and functionality of what we're trying to generalize to. And in terms of practice, if we can replicate those key information sources, if we can replicate and understand what they are, there is more likely to be transfer over. And working in high performance sport, that is still the fundamental and key question for coaches, is how do we maximize what we're doing here so that it shows up here? And so it still underpins thinking every day in the role that I do. But I think how we get there is the real nuance and challenge.
So what, just for those who are not immersed in it as we are, what's action fidelity and what's functionality? What does that mean for somebody?
So action fidelity was built off work in ecological psychology and inspired by work of flight simulators. So is what we're seeing in terms of the action replicating what we'd see in that performance environment. So in terms of flight simulators, are the actions of the pilots actually reflective of what they would do if they were flying that plane in that simulated context? So a lot of the work around representative learning design was about sampling and simulating. There's been some work over the last few years around the slice of the game or the key aspect or the key task, and not everything has to be present for you to be able to have key information to allow you to have a really functional task. And functionality, in the original work, I think we talked about in terms of are the decisions being based on the same information sources. So if we were to take away key aspects, are we actually making decisions and movements in the same way? And we did that through the task vehicle, as Keith always taught us, around ball machines in interceptive sports. So if you removed all the pre-release kinematics of a bowler and use a ball machine, the batsman can still satisfy that task, but in terms of functionality, they're using different information to drive their actions or the decisions in their actions. That might be appropriate depending on the intention of the practice task. But if you're using a ball machine or you're using a training task to try and replicate a particular thing, then you need to be mindful of what information is present. So it started off as a simple framework for people to start to consider what is it that needs to be present in the practice environment to maximize the transfer of the skills to competition.
So there's a lovely link there between your study with the work with the long jumper. So it was still about running to a board that you had on the edge of the pit and then hit that board and fly, basically. But the foam pit obviously allowed him to feel comfortable about landing, not going to get hurt, which then encouraged him to run up faster. I remember you put a little hurdle in to start with, so it was like a nested constraint to start with. It comes back to that, what is the emergent constraint was this need to get vertical lift, or, vertical impulse. So you put that in, that got in vertical impulse. You could then take that away, and then it was about the flight and the landing. But obviously transferring that back, you took him back outside fairly quickly and did it again in the real jump. few in there, then back in again. And I think that's a really good example of how you might use artificial, or how you might use the concept around bowling machines, for example. So I would say we've got a bowling machine here. What do we lose? Well, we lose all those pre-kinematic cues. Can I replicate that in some way? Well, I can adjust the height so that I don't have the length in the same way. And if I use old balls, it'll create more variability anyway. But I might do 6 balls of that, and then I'm going to go over here and face 6 balls against the bowler, so that I'm not spending my time completely getting attuned to this information that is less useful. So I think that's a real nice idea of the bowling machine still got some use in a representative learning context, because there's a ball coming towards you and it bounces and you have to hit it. So what you mark, what score you'd give that on a dial out of 10, I don't know. It might be a 5, but it's still useful if we haven't got a bowler, as long as we understand how to adapt, like the speed of the ball and things like that, to take account that those cues are not missing. But what it doesn't allow is to tune to the bowler's action. So we want to spend an equal length of time, if not more. I mean, ideally in the real world, we face bowlers all the time, but we can't.
But I know we talked about this a lot through the PhD, and we were very mindful, and I think we even wrote about it in, or I think I may have wrote about it in a chapter with maybe Adam Gorman, and we talked about, just because something's in the real environment or the representative environment doesn't mean it's a good training task. And just because it's in, so if we take the cricket analogy, if it's in a full field middle wicket scenario, doesn't mean that it's got good purpose, good intention, and it's helping learning. Just because it's in a net situation doesn't mean that it's not, or it can't be designed to aid learning. So we really started, particularly in work with Para, we started to talk about task design. So what is the right task for what we're trying to achieve, and what does that need to look like at this point in time for this athlete? So some of our sports will use the terminology drills. I don't mind if that's the terminology that environment uses, but it's what does that need to look like, and how do we continue to evolve it more towards what they're going to face in competition? And so that was really and some of our work in tennis with Lyndon Krause with the representative practice assessment tool was, whatever the training task looks like, what are the things that you could potentially use as progressions or challenges or changes to start to move that dial a little bit more towards replicating the competition environment? We don't always want to replicate all those factors, but what are the things that we can tweak and change? Because ultimately, it's about being able to perform better in that competition environment, particularly in the space we work in, which is ultimately about winning medals.
It's such an important framework. Like, I'm just thinking the amount of sports that, so I'm thinking, well, rugby, both coaches of rugby at the minute with head injuries and CTE. If coach had a better understanding of these ideas, these principles, I just think it would make things so much easier for me in terms of designing that weekly program or monthly program, whatever it's going to be. Because I don't know all the details, but there's limits on the amount of types of training you can do, intensity, contact, so on and so forth. So, all right, it's not always going to look like the game, the match. However, there is still things we can faithfully represent in the practice to still help with becoming more efficient at tackling. And certainly I'm thinking rugby union, when you've got 6'7", 8", and taller players that are trying to tackle, I think it's the shoulder height or sternum height or whatever it is, there's still things that we can use this framework to still design sessions that are going to have impact. As you say, Ross, you don't always have to be full contact, trying to bash each other. You can be a bit more sophisticated how we go about designing those practices. Yeah, so important.
I think it's always for me, it's very often, I say always, it's very often the key link into working with a program. Invariably, it's one of the key questions that comes up is why isn't this transferring to a competition environment? But one of the key ways that we tackle it is to actually reverse engineer. So when I started working with say when I started working with table tennis, for example, my first task was to understand what was happening in competition. And so a little bit of simple data analysis told me that in a particular class, the average rally length was 4 shots. And so that started a conversation with, well, okay, so if the average rally length is 4 shots, what emphasis are we placing on those 4 shots being the serve, return, third ball, fourth ball in training? I'd say originally probably a large percentage of table tennis training around the world is reasonably repetitive, reasonably prescribed in terms of its placement location. So you might do a lot of repetitive drills where there's an inherent variability, but a lot of it is 2 to the backhand, 1 to the forehand, or something similar. And so we started to shift our thinking around, well, if the average rally length is 4 shots, how do we start to place more emphasis on serve and return? And how do we start to evolve our thinking in that space? So I don't think I ever said the phrase representative learning design to that sport. Some sports will talk about match like, some will talk about specificity, some will talk about representativeness, but starting to evolve their thinking and their framework around how we're going to replicate that competition environment is often the real trigger to then be able to explore things like levels of practice variability with maintaining or simplifying tasks over decomposing tasks. And for me, that's really the takeoff point for starting to explore some of these more nuanced ideas.
I think the other thing that strikes me here is this is almost like I won't use the word gold standard because I don't think that's right, but it's almost that you're describing a template how coach development, effective coach development should look like, what it should look like. So I just feel a lot of the time people are just coach developers are going in with these preconceived ideas. And what really resonated with me, Ross, is the bit you spoke about, where's somebody coming from? So you're getting to know the individual, maybe why are they thinking the way they do, what's making them tick, like the socio-cultural background, historical background of that individual. So it's a lot deeper, and the connection you're developing with that individual to work with them more effectively is a lot more effective. So yeah, I just think this is a really interesting way that you can start to think about coach development.
One of the things we're doing with this, sorry, Ian, one of the things we're doing with this, I guess, reimagining of how we can approach this from in Australia is, I think we've got some incredible practitioners, we've got some world-leading partnerships and sports that are really wanting to push boundaries. But that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of those partnerships take time to build and to build trust. And we're starting to challenge ourselves of, we know that traditional approaches to education in this space or development in this space are less than as effective as we'd like, workshop activities or education modules, because they don't meet the social cultural needs of individual sports. And so we're starting to challenge ourselves around, well, how can we look to be even more effective and efficient and work with more sports and more coaches than we already do? And so that's going to be an interesting challenge, because where we've seen the most shift has been in those really strong partnerships, those where you're working closely with the coach and you're helping them evolve their thinking and their practice. And a lot of that comes down to really understanding what is the coach's belief of their role in developing skill, and what is their understanding of what learning is in skill development for athletes. Often, I think we go straight to the task, or we go straight to the instructional feedback. But if we start to understand the belief component, we understand why or what we're trying to achieve, then your session design falls out of that. And then the tasks in which you design and the way in which you provide instruction or scaffold with questions are all based on how you see your role in skill development. So if you believe your role as a coach, and we've got I've worked with some coaches previously where they came through a system, they were very successful as an athlete and then as a coach, and their belief was that their role was error correction. And so asking them to ask questions didn't make a lot of sense to them, because that doesn't fit with their core belief of what their role is. So we've actually got to meet them at that point and build it together. And I was definitely guilty at times of having not necessarily a direction, even an end point in mind. Like I think we can evolve to this point, which is me trying to put a linear path on a non-linear process. And so I might have a direction in mind. I might think that a sport can evolve and there's opportunities to get more effective in this area or this area, but it has to be driven by the humans, and it has to be authentic to the social cultural constraints of the sport.
Yeah.
The biggest barrier on coaches evolving their thinking and changing their behavior is the culture and the constraints within the specific sport.
I suppose from a systems point of view as well. So I mean, the system that you might be part of, there could be pressure to deliver a certain amount of things as a coach developer. What are you measuring to just demonstrate your value? But this approach, that's got to go. Like, just give people time to develop relationships. Informal meetings, chats over a coffee. Like, just get to know people. Because this process, the way I'm thinking about it, it's not like like you say, it's not a linear process. Week 1, we're going to do this. Week 2, it's just an emergent, evolving relationship that happens. And at certain time points, it will be ready for, right, let's talk about this. Let's really challenge our thinking around this area.
Our coach development area here, they've lent in really into social learning approaches, a unique Australian approach with kinship and care, and really understanding the readiness of coaches for different areas. So me being able to come in and blend skill-ac and learning design into that coach development area is going to allow us to really hopefully accelerate this area for coach development. But your point around the system, that's the fascinating thing. My current role is there's also accountability. There's also, there's large amounts of funding going to sports or going to departments, and people need to show impact. They need to show performance outcomes. And interestingly, going back to our discussion of para, I genuinely believe the reason that we were able to do the things we were able to do is because we were in para, and there were ingredients that allowed us to be innovative, but there was also resource constraints. There was also sports where they probably didn't have the history of working in a particular way or coaching in a particular way, which allowed us more freedom, allowed us to take risks. A lot of our sports, ultimately judged on medal outcomes. Yet, there's a big push in Australia for a lot of other measures, particularly around our strong focus on win well. But ultimately, the coach's role is to help deliver medal outcomes. So it's a risk for them to try something different. And so I think that's the real complexity and nuance, and for me, the fun part of how do we manage all those challenges.
I think that I wanted to come to that, because that importance of the empathetic approach, working with the coach, and I know you've talked about working with a particular coach, and I think you and him described it as it took 5 years for you to get that. Now, that's maybe because of the para context and because he was good and he kept his job. Maybe in a lot of sports, in high pressure sports, and you're not going to get that long. So building trust is a really crucial thing. And I talked about how I stole this from you. So you better tell the truth now, or tell the truth as I know it, or tell the story. But how do you go about when you start working with a coach to build trust? What's your strategies to get them to trust you and believe in you and then work with you? Yeah, I think it's
It's an interesting question, and it's one of those ones where you wish you just had a really simple, oh, you just do this and this, which is not the case. Everybody's different. Everybody comes from a different experience and background, and there is a bit of that cliched kind of, you meet them where they're at. My approach, and I've had this feedback from coaches that kind of tells me that this was the thing that landed, was it's the classic Ted Lasso: be curious but not judgmental. Like, I'm my I guess drive, the thing that I love doing is helping people think differently. And so I'm genuinely going into environments just curious about how they work. Sometimes you might see an environment and you see things and you go, oh, that's quite repetitive, or that there's probably not a decision linked to that action like there would be in competition, but there's a reason for that. There's a reason why that's evolved. There's a reason why that's, there could be a long historical underpinning. It could be an individual athlete historical factor. It could be a coaching experience. It could be the coach's own athletic career that has influenced that design. But I think going in and just being genuinely curious around how you can collaborate. The other factor was with my role at Paralympics Australia back in 2013, allowed me so much opportunity to go and explore environments and take the time. And it wasn't necessarily a long time, but it was allowed me to go into environments. I'm here to observe. I'm here to help. This is my role. This is how we'll build how we're going to collaborate as we go. But essentially, I'm here to help you, and we're here to co-design how we go forward. And so I've always had that natural curiosity, but I've also always gone in really making sure that it was about non-judgmental approach to what was happening, and really trying to understand what was happening and potentially why it was happening. And sometimes that disarmed coaches, and you'd ask, why might you design it like this, or why do you do it in this 10-minute block? And often there wasn't a particular reason. It was their coach had taught them that. And so that then starts to allow those windows of, oh, okay, well, so we can change that then. So, we do 10 minutes of this drill. Well, we know that the average set length at a games is 6 minutes. So what if we started basing it more around, I guess, the workloads of and decision-making demands within a 6-minute window? So it allowed you to start go, and then it was. I remember the one of the coaches going. Then it just made sense. This is what we're trying to aim to. Obviously, that's an average, and we made sure we're prepared for the extremes, but that's what we're preparing for. So why wouldn't we try and replicate that? And so I think there's a authenticity, I think, to that the coaches respond to. I had to go in and be myself, but you have to go in and probably a little restrained as well in terms of your enthusiasm. And I've had the pleasure of being able to bring a few PhD scholars on board and hopefully give them some guidance as they've evolved, and some of the messaging or the ideas that we talk about is I guess humility. They've got a lot of evidence that what they do works. You've got very little evidence for the ideas you're bringing into that sport with those athletes at that level of performance. Put yourself in that coach's shoes, and would you, if you're a table tennis coach with 30 years experience, would you trust a Englishman that's never picked up a table tennis bat in his life? And then some simple frameworks. So I talked about the design thinking concept earlier. I spent some time really diving down different avenues in particularly in technology fields. Like, they're the masters at getting us to change our behavior. And that's the missing piece for me in skill at the moment. And that's where we're hopefully going with our approaches. The principles, the ideas, the evidence is great. Fundamentally, our job is to change behavior and to change thinking. And so I disappeared down different rabbit holes and explored kind of design principles, things like MAYA, M-A-Y-A, so most advanced yet acceptable. So comes from an industrial design background, and it's a really neat concept to keep in mind. It's, what would be novel enough and advanced enough to start to progress this learning environment or this training task, but isn't going to be so far a jump that it's too much and it's too far removed from what the coach or the athlete would be comfortable with. If you think about your iPhone, the new iPhone comes out and it's just advanced enough that you go, that's worth paying and upgrading, but it's not so advanced that you then pick it up and have no idea how to operate it. These companies are the masters at getting us to adopt and to change and to grow. So how do we start to embed those principles with how we support coaches and athletes to evolve?
I think that's really great point around if you go in with a new way that you can obviously, if you really buy into that, there's a danger of becoming pretty evangelical about that. And you just go all in. I'm going to do this approach. You lot know what you're doing. We go bang, and it's beyond the mayor. It's too far, and you're not going to have any impact. You're not going to resonate as well. So it's working that. How can I move this in iterations, isn't it? I know you talk a lot about iterations. Yeah. The other thing, one of the things that never fails to impress me in your work is your creativity and your ability to look at things differently and solve a problem. And I know something that I like, and I know we've been talking about, is this single session research idea, like the idea we can make a change in a single session. And I think it's come really from the Mindflick people have been doing, Tim Pitt and people like that have been doing a lot of work behind that. But if you can have an impact like that, you don't. There's always a criticism of constraint-led approaches and games. It takes longer, which we know is not true necessarily. It could be that you can have like sudden changes, and I think you've got that capability to design an activity that's like what Pete Arnott described as the cigar moment. Like you do that and it changes, which is what he did with my golf swing. But I saw you, or I know an example of that where you did in athletics. Again, I don't know whether we put that into that paper, but it's a brilliant example of looking at things differently. Can you share that, or is that a bit?
Yeah, I think I love your point around the single session, and you don't change behavior in a single session. You don't change skills in a single session, but you can change people's perception, and that might be a coach or that might be an athlete. And I think you can problem. One of the like I said, the big focuses for us is how do we become better problem definers? We talk about problem solvers. We talk about problem setting in terms of training design, but one of the bigger gaps is, are we actually solving the right problem? Do we actually know what the root cause of the problem is? The example that you're referring to Ian, was working with a coach, and we had a sprinter, and there was a technical change they were looking to make, and essentially as they were coming out of the blocks, their back leg, and this is the level of detail that we get to in terms of high performance sport, and very well learned skills that you're trying to change or you're trying to refine, and their back leg was essentially coming up and kind of a long arc before it got back down on the track. So anybody who knows track sprinting, you want to get that first step out of the block planted so you can accelerate. And so we're talking still very fast movements, but a bit of a rotation of the foot up in the air before it comes back to the ground, rather than kind of that movement where the toe kind of stays facing down close to the track. A lot of sprinters almost drag their toe along the track from that first stride or so. And it was something that they've been exploring for a while, and they hadn't quite figured out the right cue or the right way to help the athlete to get that change. And so we started to break it down. We started to understand, what was the athlete's perspective, what was happening. Again, I won't go into too much detail of the specifics, but we ended up designing essentially a physical constraint to shape the movement. So what we essentially discovered was the athlete didn't know what they were looking for. They didn't know what they were trying to get to in terms of the technical movement. So simple customized hurdle worked at the point at when the sprinter was in the maximum position at set. And essentially at that point, it just grazed the hairs on the back of the leg. And there was no complex instruction. It was just start, but you just can't kick the hurdle over. And it was instant change in terms of the movement. So essentially was able to attain the movement they're looking for within that first trial. And so that wasn't the result. That wasn't it wasn't instant change and no regression. There was, but it was pretty close, because suddenly now the athlete had something to reference. They could then work to develop a cue that helps them understand what they were trying to achieve. And so again, it comes back to, are we really understanding what the root of the problem is? Is it that they can't attain it? Is it a physical aspect, or is it simply that they need to almost shift their perception of what they're looking for? Like I said, that's become a real focus for us of how do we help people become the best problem solvers when it comes to setting up learning tasks.
Yeah, beautiful story. There you go, Marty.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah. Just listening intently. Yeah, with that, I mean, it just makes me think. So when I, different to what Ross is talking about, but when I might be presenting to a group of coaches, I always try and say, like, think about who are you coaching. I don't mean Johnny from up the road or Sarah down the street or whatever. It's like the human body is adaptable. It's an open, dynamic system that you can influence, and it's adopting this mindset that, how can I best influence? You're not trying to program a human body. You're just trying to create the conditions that are trying to facilitate the types of skillfulness that you're developing for that particular sport or event or whatever it might be. So, yeah, and that really made me think about that. So, I think that's an important start point from how a coach might be thinking about these. But yeah, some fascinating insights, Ross. Sounds like you've got a really exciting role.
It's an area that we're probably starting to really double down on as well, in terms of think about who you're coaching, but what does that mean? And how detailed can we go in terms of our understanding of creating learning environments for particular athletes? Again, conscious of, a lot of people will be listening and they're probably in community sport and they've got large groups, and that can be a real challenge to go to the level of individualization. But in high performance sport, you've often got a lot more coaches to athlete ratio. And one of the things we're really challenging our coaches to think about is, what can you learn about your athletes that can help you create those really impactful learning moments? So what do you know about them outside of sport? What are their other passions? What are their other areas of interest? What were their favorite subjects at school? What are the areas that we can probe to actually influence our training design? And essentially that's, getting to new levels of co-design. So how do we make training tasks even more engaging? So, I've obviously had the privilege of working in para, and that drives you to really understand the individual. But every athlete we work with is an individual, and I get the opportunity to work closely with our network of practitioners, and particularly with Sean Barris here in Adelaide, who works across Olympic and Paralympic sport, and to see the level of individuality that goes into that work with her coaches and athletes, to make sure that we get the maximum uptake in terms of whether it's a coach development workshop, whether it's a training activity. How do we engage that athlete? How do we understand what makes them tick, or what fires them up, or how we might overload or progress tasks towards adding pressure for competition? And the level of individuality that we can get to, I think, is the next next level of co-design and performance preparation.
That is an area coaches, from my observations and experiences, that is an area coaches struggle with big time, like individualizing sessions. So I'm thinking team sports here a lot, not like Olympic individual sports, but individualizing practice. So what you're seeing a lot of now in football or soccer, because the money's there and it's on vogue, people are just copying each other, but there's a lot of individualized coaches, and you go and watch it, and it's like the team's coach training over there, and there's a coach with one player over here. So straight away, I mean, it has, again, I'm not trying to say that's got no use, but when you see a lot of the practices, it's like, I'm not so sure that's useful. Rather than working with the player in the context of the practice. So it would take an element of co-design with maybe the head coach or whoever would be involved and the individual. But why not do it through that practice? It's an area that I think we need to improve on. Ross, I'm just thinking, if anybody's like, oh, this co-design, it's really sort of, it's really sparks an interest. And I know we've got the human element that, you've got to get to know people, really get to know people, not the athlete, the person. What would be like, because for some coaches, I know this is like never work, like it's a real big step into the unknown, and maybe you're giving a bit away control and all these sort of things. What could be some like things they could try just to get working in this way? And I know it's all individualized and it would be very specific to different contexts, but is there any sort of not recommendations, but any tips you could give that people could start to try and dip the toe into this?
Yeah, I think one of the barriers I've definitely seen with the term co-design is it's seen as an equal collaboration. And one of the really big pushbacks early is, oh, my athlete's not experienced enough to be involved in that. And that potentially is something we need. Maybe it's through the literature, or maybe it's through some of our applied work. Is we need to break down what we mean by that. Essentially, we want athletes engaged in their own skill learning. That's essentially what it is, and maybe that's a softer way to start to address it. So that could be we get them to help us design their 3 priorities for the week. Maybe it's and they rank them, and so we know what they see as the biggest priority. It could be that within a training session, we're working on a particular aspect, and we say, okay, we're working on this. There's probably a few ways we could design it. Are you thinking, this or this? So you're starting to building a bit of choice and a bit of co-contribution from the athlete. Working in some of our sports, there was one stage I was working with a sport, and we had 5 podium athletes, and I would say that their training was co-designed, and it looked completely different for every athlete. And so I think one of the miss points is we co-design how we co-design, and that can evolve, and that can be, an athlete might turn up and they've had a heavy week, they've been working, they've had exams, and they're fried, and they just need a session where the coach takes a bit more control or directs it a little bit more. And I'm not talking necessarily about prescribed. I'm talking about maybe they do the bulk of the designing, because the athlete just needs to be able to use their what they have left in the actual training itself.
Mm.
But I think just starting with how might we engage them more, and asking them how they think they can contribute, asking them for a level of choice. And a lot of the time, one of the barrier is not necessarily, I guess, I don't see a lot of coaches wanting to give up control. I see a lot of athletes that maybe haven't had the opportunity to develop the skill set to contribute. And so part of that is about how do we scaffold that process to give them the skill set to contribute to their own design.
Yeah. And that's giving, maybe start with a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more, isn't it? Just bring them in, yeah, like help me design this a little bit. I love the idea of going back to childhood, really, and the games you used to make up as kids, and capturing that, trying to get people to do that. Yeah, we've got a game, like what do you want to work on? Right. Could we make a game up around this? Where could we go? Like just try and develop that creativity again. And that seems to be knocked out of people, or they're not practicing doing it because we don't do it any, people are not growing up.
I remember a coach once said to me, we had this athlete come in and they were very creative and they had their own way of solving the problems, and we drilled it out of them.
Yeah.
But then there's a very there's an expectation of what training looks like, and there's a history of I've trained in this way. So then we then suddenly ask athletes, well, change something, or design your own training, and they haven't got the skill set or the experience to do it. So we just started to build some simple tools for the athletes to use. So thinking about a racket sport, it's in this setup, what progressions could you add? You could add an additional placement. You could add 2 additional locations on the table. You could add a serve. You could keep the design pretty standard, but you could add points. So there's a bit of pressure on that execution. So you're almost giving them a menu of things to be able to choose from. And over time, they develop a sense of, okay, I'm at this point, I need to make it more challenging. These are the things that often work well for me, or these are the things I haven't tried in a while. And it's about building not only their capability, but their confidence to begin to contribute to training design. Much the same as we'd work with a coach in that space.
Yeah. Which is, as Eleanor Gibson said, agency is it something along the lines of agency is the human's primary mode, or something like that. And it's true, isn't it? You work with a group of kids that just, what's that bat for? And they'll come up with 50 different answers, or what's that chair for? Whereas you ask an adult what to sit on. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, yeah.
I like that idea. Just jumping in. I like the idea of agency. I think coaches. I think some coaches might be a little bit hesitant when we talk about autonomy, because I think that comes across as athlete driving everything, or leading everything in some instances. But I think the idea of agency, of the athlete having the ability to challenge, to come up with new ideas, to input into training, is a really important nuance.
Yeah, just want to quickly just touch on this individuality, which, as Martin said, is a lot of coaches will go, I don't have time for that. How would I, how can I've got a squad of 12, and like you saying that you've got 5 podium athletes, that's 5 different programs you've got to do. How do you manage the time? How much time goes into individualizing it, and how do you cope with it? How does your coach, who is a volunteer, deal with the time it takes to design that? Or is there, is it not quite as long as we think it is? Or
I think it's scarier than in reality it can be, if it's well supported. Right. And I think it's, we didn't jump to having a whole squad of athletes where we were this level of detail and this level of individualization. We started with a radical athlete, a radical coach that were wanting to push boundaries. And then we extended that to a group of athletes that we wanted to prioritize. And in high performance sport, often we do have to prioritize and make those tough decisions of where we're putting our resourcing. But as we're doing that, we're creating more time because the athletes are starting to take more ownership. They're starting to input into training. They're starting to become a little bit more self-reliant. They're able to start progressing their own training tasks. They're starting to educate the next athletes down. Of course, that's a few-year process, but there's so many benefits to that. One is the amount of time that goes into planning and to set that up becomes the focus, and then it allows you to be more free in training environments. I know you would have spoken to Craig Morris and that idea of being really prepared but not planned. So really establish well-planned setups for sessions, but allowing you then to react to what's in front of you and allowing the athletes to contribute. And ultimately, for me, that is, I guess, the challenge for us as a high performance system is that's starting to create good coaches for the future. So we've got athletes that are helping design their own learning, and the majority of our coaches at the moment are coming through from athlete backgrounds. So they're coming through potentially without having come through physical education, pedagogy, sports science, but in the next 4 or 5 years, are we getting athletes through that have got really good understanding of learning design because they've lived it and co-design with their coaches?
So we're gonna come to the situation, hopefully, where I coach like I coached is going to be seen as a positive rather than a negative.
Yeah.
I think
that should be our ultimate mission. And it's a long-term view for what the system could look like, and it requires us to lose the short term. So I haven't got time to do that level of planning for all 12, but actually how do we work, again, reverse engineer from what do we want the system to look like in 6 to 8 years time, and how do we start that process? And we might need to pick and this was my point around behavior change is starting to think about things like how we change people's behavior. So we start with our radicals, much like the tech companies do. You get your early adopters. So who are our early adopters? We start to challenge what's possible with those early adopters. Very quickly, you get the early majority because they see what's happening and they want in. The trick is that next bulk of people under that bell curve. Of seeing, they need to see success, they need to see evidence. So that's where we're at as a system at the moment. Is we've got some pioneers, we've got some people that are really pushing boundaries, we've got some early adopters, and now we're hopefully creating this momentum so that we can create change. It's much the same as how a coach might work in their programs. Where are the athletes and the hubs or the coaches where you can create change? I had an athlete talk to me about their journey of working and worked under a coach leading into the Paralympic Games last year, and they really challenged their thinking about what was possible in terms of the design of their technical and skill development, and they reflected that because of where they were in terms of geographically located, it allowed them to create a really innovative environment. If they were in a centralized program, that doesn't happen because there's an expectation. There's a social constraint on what it looks like. And so how do we create environments or how do we target those radical environments that allow people to try different things, demonstrate success, and then bring others on board? So I think it's losing a bit of the short-term impact for the real long-term gain of what that might mean.
You think this might be related or might be going back a little bit to the idea of design thinking, but I know one of the key concepts that you've used is the idea of universal design. Do you think that would help create the structures for sessions that you can really just adapt very quickly? So maybe we need to just explain what universal design is first, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's related to that point. My experience of working in Para was you're working at I don't want to say the extremes. You're working in such a diverse context that you're working with. It's elite sport. You're working with often very resource constrained environments. Coaches are often part-time or volunteer. It's changing in Australia with our uplift at the moment, but that was the environment I was in 10, 12 years ago. And so you're really forced to be creative with your solutions. And it really challenges thinking around learning design around the most adaptable opportunities. And one of the, I genuinely believe that I'm a better practitioner, a better problem solver, a better complex thinker because I've worked in Para. I'll never know how I would have developed if I hadn't gone straight into working in Para as my applied background. But a lot of our coaches talk about they are a better coach because they've worked in this space, and because it challenges your assumptions, it forces you to think differently about your communication. It adds so many different elements, and it's potentially a opportunity for us to translate those ideas to all of coach development. So this idea of universal design of largely comes from a disability infrastructure concept of, if we design with the more extreme user in mind, so those that are going to be most challenged by the product, by the infrastructure, or by maybe it's a building design, then not only will we make sure that everyone can access that program, that facility, but we'll also come up with ideas that are better for everyone. So if we design maybe we're designing with somebody in mind who uses a wheelchair. Well, we design curb cutouts or we design ramps. That means that the person who has an accident and breaks their leg can easily transfer up that ramp, or the parent with a pushchair can use the ramp rather than having to find someone to help them climb up the stairs. So if we go to the more extreme users in our population, the ones that are most affected, the most challenged by being able to access this facility, will make it better for everyone. We adopt that for coach development, for program design. If we design in mind with those that are working in diverse contexts, that might be in women's high performance sport, that might be in para sport, that might be in masters sport, then we're going to create more adaptable, more effective coaches, full stop. And so I actually, challenged, or at least shared a thought a few years ago within the Australian system of, if we focus on para for 2032, not only will we win more Paralympic medals, we'll win more Olympic medals, because we'll really start to challenge our thinking around this idea of learning design. And it's such a rich environment for people to develop in.
Superb. Brilliant, Ross.
Yeah, fascinating. My head's spinning. Got lots of things to think about. Yeah,
covered a lot of ground there, didn't we?
We did.
Yeah,
we got I think just about everything we'd want to do. Well, there's a few more things, but we'll have to have you back later. I know Keith wants to jump on with you at some point, so
just let me know when you're nearing your 100th episode, then I'll pop back as a
well, that was in a year, and I think the goal is to be a bit more selective, isn't it? So Ross, thank you so much for your time.
That brilliant, Ross.
I think people will take so much from that. As they said, every time we talk, I go away thinking my brain is going off all over the place. It's great. So which goes back to exploration and coming up with more innovative ideas and finding more time in life to read.
I mean, this episode will be a fantastic resource for people on all levels of the performance pathway, or coaches as well in the community game.
Okay.
Yeah, really, really useful.
Community level as well. I think there's so much to take.
Absolutely. Yeah. So look, appreciate your time. Thanks, Ross, and take care.
Thanks for having me. Great chance to reflect, and hopefully people can dig into some of those ideas and frameworks.